our man Hasan Topal from the northern suburbs of Melbourne became a real-life violent outlaw bikie, a suspected killer, and now an international fugitive. Now, the trouble started at 3 o'clock in the morning, which of course is when most bad things do happen. These idiots opened fire immediately. They hit the innocent kid in the chest. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Today we're going to talk about one of the pretty boys of the crime scene, and in fact the bikie crime scene, which is a significant element of crime in modern Australia. First, should point out that the underworld and the criminal milieu and lawbreakers have always attracted their share of pretty faces, narcissists and people who have a high regard for their own image and their own looks. And in folklore, of course, this goes all the way back to Robin Hood. In American gangster folklore, there was Pretty Boy Floyd, there was Babyface Nelson. In Carlton, we used to have one Alphonse Gangatano, known probably because he said it himself as the De Niro of Lygon Street, until a very ugly man called Jason Moran rearranged him with a gun. And that is the background to the rise of a bikie and crook called Hasan Topal, or Hasan Topal. And Hasan Topal first came to public notice about a decade ago when, as a very young man, a very handsome young man, he turned up on the doorstep of a major modelling agency in Melbourne because I think a freelance photographer had taken pictures of him to promote something like a rave party, that sort of stuff. And he was an edgy-looking young Turkish guy, well-built, but not overly well-built, handsome, brooding, all the rest of it. And this was enough to sort of attract a little bit of attention from the Chadwick's Models Agency, who have a big branch office in Melbourne. They're headquartered in Sydney, and they handle a lot of very famous faces around Australia and indeed around the world. And when Hasan Topal came around, he picked up some part-time work modelling clothes mostly to sell to the unsuspecting, and he was quite good at it, just like, 50 other young guys who were quite good at it. They're not faceless people, but they're, to some extent, most of them nameless. Only the really prominent models become well known by name. The others, like Hasan Topal, are just the average good-looking clothes horse who come and go as the fashions wax and wane. And by fashion agency standards, he really was, this Turkish kid was just another pretty face. But among the more sort of androgynous players in that field, some guys who look, extremely feminine, he was sort of more on the masculine side of handsome. He had that sort of brooding, slightly edgy look that can look good on a model. Before and after the camera stopped clicking, nothing about the way Hasan spoke or acted suggested the sort of murderous rage or deep-seated malice or viciousness that leads to, blood being spilt and bullets being fired and bodies being battered. I talked to a Chadwick's model agency talent scout about young Hasan Topal, and he said to me, he was gentle, he was polite, he was genuinely nice. He said he was all please and thank you. He just was so well behaved, softly spoken, did everything right, not a prima donna. Clearly, he thought sort of well brought up from a family where he understood how the world worked. So it came as a great surprise to that talent scout and to everyone who knew Hasan Topal from the little bit of work he did at Chadwick's to find out within a few years that their muscular former model had been filmed in rather different circumstances. Now, I have to say that plenty of models fancy stepping up to acting so that they can play at being more than a clothes horse. And a big example of that in Australia is the great George Lazanby, who was just a young buck from nowhere much, who'd been noticed because he was a big, strong guy and good looking. He'd been picked up as a model to sell clothes or whatever it was, and was confident and keen, and he went overseas to London and he somehow talked his way into playing James Bond, a role that he played quite well and indeed should have kept playing had he not screwed it up by imagining he could go off and be a film star doing things other than James Bond. It was a very seriously bad error on his part, and it consigned him to the dustbin of film history. He's become the answer to a trivia question. George Lazanby, after hitting the high spots in one Bond movie. Now, the point is that a lot of these models think that they might be able to make it in speaking parts, but only a few do. Chadwicks, interestingly, have produced a few of those over the years. Rachel Hunter, the one who, among other things, went on to star in films and things and to marry a fellow called Rod Stewart. And Elle Macpherson, she went from modelling to acting. And a third one, in Australian modern context, is Travis Fimmel, who went from being probably a fairly minor model to being a fairly major actor. He, of course, got the lead part in the massively popular drama series Vikings. Travis was a kid from a dairy farm up near Echuca who thought he might try out for acting rather than milk cows or drive trucks, and so he did, and he became very big on it, and now he's in Los Angeles making a very good living. Whereas Travis Fimmel played a Viking warrior, a make-believe warrior covered in tattoos that were applied by makeup artists to play a made-up story, our man Hasan Topal from the northern suburbs of Melbourne became a real-life violent outlaw bikie, a suspected killer, and now an international fugitive. His tattoos, like the violence, are absolutely real. But you'd have to say that he does have an actor's flair for the dramatic. If there's one thing that marks the change from what the talent scout at Chadwicks called the nice Turkish boy, it was in August 2017 when a big mob of Comanchero bikies gathered in a strip club in the Canberra suburb of Fyshwick after their annual national run. Every year, the big bikie groups have runs and they pick out a spot to drive their bikes to, and they all get on the highway in great big columns of motorbikes, Harley-Davidsons, and a few of them follow up or lead the way with mainly four-wheel drives or big utes with their supplies of whatever they might need. Sometimes they call those vehicles war wagons, and they get to where they're going, and then they have a lot of end-of-season footy trip stuff for bikies, which can lead to trouble, which indeed is what happened in Canberra in 2017. Now, the trouble started at 3 o'clock in the morning, which of course is when most bad things do happen. They say nothing good happens after 2 a.m. What happened in the Capital Club in Fyshwick in Canberra was that at around 3 a.m, there's a group of these guys in the smoking room at the club. You know, they're law-abiding bikies. Instead of lighting up smokes out in the public bar area, they go into the smoking room like good little boys and girls and light their ciggies. And there was a problem in there because, and this is all caught on camera, on security camera, there's a problem there, and they start an argument and then they start a bit of a fight, and the fight spills into the main bar, which is a very big bar full of people. And this ignites an absolute riot. And this riot is caught on camera. It goes for 10 or 15 minutes, which is a long time. The club is full when it starts and it empties out. I think the staff and the strippers and everybody like that tended to get out of the place to not be hurt. They grab glasses and things and get them out of the way so that the bikies don't start throwing glasses or breaking them to stab each other. More than half the crowd, I would say, very heavily muscled men wearing Comanchero tracksuit tops, T-shirts and hoodies, all that sort of merchandise that bikies seem to think is necessary to wear. Gone are the days when they just wear really dirty old denim and leather jerkins that reek of sweat and blood and beer. They seem to wear the sort of thing that you might wear if you're a light heavyweight fighter or kickboxer or something like that, because most of them seem to follow that sort of lifestyle. Now, anyone who wanted real-life footage to make an advertisement to show the effects of steroids should get hold of the CCTV film from this strip club. It's a bit of an eye-opener because you've got roid rage to the power 3. And of all this seething mass of punching, kicking, snarling humanity, Hasan Topal stands out. He's one of 4 Comancheros later charged over the brawl. And no wonder. First, he attacks a man, punching him to the floor in pretty fine style. Then he pulls a stunt that looks as if Quentin Tarantino scripted it for Mel Gibson or Schwarzenegger. He smashes a glass on his head, drawing blood. He's bleeding from his own head, which would seem to be not a great thing to do if you fancy yourself as a handsome model. He then peels off his shirt so that he's naked from the waist up. And then he goes back to the fight that he's just left and he launches a fresh attack against the man lying on the floor. Now, obviously, the man on the floor was very unpopular with Hasan Topal and some of his mates for whatever reason. When the victim sort of regained consciousness, because he'd been knocked out, and he tries to stumble away, Topal attacks him again, punches him in the head, knocks him down again. It's malicious and it's cold-blooded, and there it is, all on film. And at the end of it all, police came, people were arrested, this film was studied for many days, and they picked out all the worst excesses of violence, and Topal and 3 of his fellow Comancheros are charged and plead guilty to affray. One of those lovely old-fashioned words, affray, meaning, rioting and fighting, in the Canberra Magistrates Court. The prosecutor says that the extreme, prolonged and gratuitous violence is in the very worst category of assault. And although Hasan Topal didn't start the brawl, he was clearly a willing participant who ignored opportunities to step away, including when he was being held back. He kept punching regardless. A display, says the prosecutor, of sustained viciousness. The defence took another view. The defence says that Topal acknowledged that he acted inexcusably, but pointed out that this was an apparently respectable young man with a health and fitness degree, a gym owner, would you believe, with a good employment history and very good family support. He wasn't, from a broken home. He wasn't a jailbird and a boys' home boy. He was from a pretty hard-working migrant family who were pretty successful. The magistrate ruled that Topal should know better and sentenced him to 10 months jail, to be suspended after 5 months. The magistrate also sent the 3 other Comancheros to jail with him. In the sentencing comments, the magistrate said Topal had good employment prospects and he urged him to consider his future and quit the Comanchero outlaw gang. Well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It seems that Topal takes only half this advice. As soon as he gets out of jail after the 5 months, he indeed considers his future closely, and he concludes fairly swiftly that his future will be more secure a long way from Australia. And so he flies to his parents' homeland of Turkey, and he hasn't been back since. Now, we don't know for sure the ins and outs of his citizenship status, but it's a fair guess that he is a dual citizen, probably born in Australia and will have Australian citizenship, but he's probably got dual citizenship because his parents were Turks by birth. So Topal goes on basically the fugitive list. But I don't know that he quits the gang, because even if our pretty boy Topal walks away, maybe the gangs won't walk away from him, and neither will the police, because it seems that both law enforcers and law breakers are waiting for him to come back to Australia, and that his critics on both sides of the law are quite confident that the brawl in Canberra was the least of his offences, which explains why he's sticking to the other side of the world at the minute. So this raises a question. What went on? What's the lead up to the brawl? What is it that Hasan Topal has been up to in those few short years after he was this handsome young model? It reminds us of that Paul Kelly song, the one that says, "What makes a sweet guy turn so mean?" Any answer to that question of what turned a model citizen into a violent thug would have to include one key word, and there's no prizes for guessing what that is. The word is drugs, as in the sort of drugs that change people's behaviour when they use them. And that's a cocktail that starts with steroids and it's topped up with cocaine and the old biker staple, methamphetamines. Bikies have been making speed and crank, as they used to call it in the bad old days, way back when, James Dean and Marlon Brando were making bikie movies in the 50s and 60s. All of those drugs command so much money on the black market that rival gangs compete with each other to import and make and sell them. It's that simple. They're called outlaw gangs for a reason, and they're outlaws because they deal massively in drugs. Not to mention a few other things like standover and debt collecting and running sex shows and nightclubs and brothels and all the rest of anything that involves making a lot of money without working. When it comes to using and distributing drugs, these outlaw bike gangs are in it up to their tattooed necks. It explains a lot about those gangs' descent into displays of extreme violence in recent years. And the story of Hasan Topal, which we've pieced together from sort of underworld gossip and police intelligence, it builds into a violent frenzy of activity in the months before that Canberra brawl in the strip club in 2017. In fact, most of it happened in that year, earlier in the year of 2017. We'll take our listeners back to the night of May the 2nd that year, when a skinny, harmless young fella called Mohammed Yusel is leaving a friend's house in Keysborough after spending the evening gaming with his mates. He's just one of those kids that sits around playing games on the computers. It's only 10 o'clock. It's not as if he'd put in an all-nighter. It's 10 o'clock. He's going home because, he's got to go to uni next day or whatever, go to work. Mohammed and his mates have been sitting in a converted garage setup while they do this gaming, and at 10 o'clock he lifts the garage door and goes to leave. He's just going to go home, and he doesn't live far away. Outside, lurking nearby, he doesn't know this, are at least two shooters, or, a car with a driver and a shooter, whatever. That'll be two guys, though, for sure. They don't even have a chance to look at him properly, because if they had looked at him, they would realise that this skinny kid is hardly the man that they've come there to shoot. Their intended target actually looks nothing like this skinny kid, Mohammed Yusel. These idiots open fire immediately. They hit the innocent kid in the chest. He falls back inside the garage, but the shooters keep firing and wound two of his terrified mates inside, the two other young guys. A week later, the police raid another house in the same street and arrest a big, burly, heavily muscled Mongol bikie, or Mongol bikie associate, named Farshad Rasuli. Now, Farshad Rasuli would weigh very close to double what Mohammed Yusel does. Photographs of him show a man who's an axe handle across the shoulders. He's got biceps as big as Sharon footballs, and he's clearly pumped up full of steroids and a lot of pumping iron. Rasuli, when the police come to visit him, is very keen to change address because he realises that he was probably the target. He's got a few problems in the meantime because when the police raid the place, they find an illegal handgun, which not every suburban person has. They find $70,000 cash, which seems probably a little bit much. And they find illegal steroids and a few other things, a few other drugs and things. Meanwhile, the search for the stupid gunman centres on a Jeep Cherokee that was used as a getaway car. Now, it was dumped at Cranbourne and torched, but these killers aren't much good at anything. They've managed to kill the wrong bloke, and now they torch the Jeep Cherokee, but it doesn't burn properly, and it leaves quite a bit of it unburnt, and the police are therefore able to retrieve a clone number plate, which they soon discover, is a clone, because when they go around to some house where those number plates are supposed to live on some car, they discover that they're copies and that the other car they've gone to have a look at has indeed been advertised on Gumtree or something, and that's where the crooks saw the registration number and decided to clone the plates. Now, the police were soon able to prove that the fake number plate was cloned on a printer at a northern suburbs gym run by Hasan Topal, our hero. He runs a gym, northern suburbs, and it's got a printer where they clone number plates. And I'm here to say that cloned number plates are the rising trend in crime. Anybody that goes out to shoot or rob or pillage, in recent years, they use cloned number plates because it's a great way to sort of divert attention in a fairly safe way, and a useful device for crooks, which is easy to do because modern printers are so good at cloning things. To kill the wrong man is one thing. To do it again shows criminal recklessness that is actually a massive threat to public safety, to all of us. The following month, June 2017, so this is only a few weeks later, someone shoots up a business in Richmond called Dream Drives. It's a luxury car business in Burnley Street, Richmond. Bullets recovered at the car place come from the same gun that killed Ucell. Can you believe that? The idiots that shot the wrong man in May are using the same gun to shoot up a car place in Richmond a few weeks later. Now, the police are really applying themselves to this job, as they should and as they did, and they discover fairly quickly that Hasan Topal had earlier visited the business and bashed an employee over what is described as a $20,000, quote, contract dispute, unquote. Now, there's no doubt it's about $20,000. What the real argument is, we don't know, but we can probably guess. Now, this sort of standover visit by Topal might have been connected to some claims which might be spurious, we don't know, made by disgruntled clients saying that the car place used to be slow to pay back cash deposits for hired luxury cars, whatever. And maybe the car hire people, who are no longer in business, had been a bit slow handing back cash deposits to people, and maybe people got sad about that and sought a bit of help from old mate Hasan Topal, who's, tough guy running a gym and probably a bit of a kickboxer and muscle man and all-round tough guy. Then again, we don't really know why he went there and asked for $20,000 and threatened to make a mess of people and cars. His negotiation style was, in fact, straight from the sort of Hollywood Tarantino playbook. He reportedly said, "I'm going to start beating you guys up one by one and then destroy your cars one by one." There's a bit of a pattern here, because on the night of July 28, this is only a few more weeks, on a Friday night, a convoy of Bandido bikers is heading south on the Balti Bridge. So that is from the northern suburbs over the Yarra towards the bay and towards the city. And they're going along there, maybe 6 or 8 of them, when an unknown shooter opens fire from an overtaking station wagon. This station wagon has screamed up past these guys who they'd be just doing the speed limit. They'd be sitting on 75, 80 Ks. Wagon goes past them. Gunshots come from the station wagon. Gunshots hit a 40-year-old bandito from Sunbury. He's hit in the chest. He crashes his bike, naturally, as you might, and he's taken to the Alfred Hospital fairly seriously injured. Now, later on, one of his fellow riders presents himself to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, also with gunshot wounds or similar. And clearly it's been an attack by someone who's not very fond of banditos, which would imply a rival outlaw gang. The suspect station wagon getaway car is found burnt out in Keysborough. The main suspect is Hasan Topal, partly because road cameras show that the wagon was fitted with clone number plates, just like the Cherokee in the earlier shooting. And incidentally, these same clone plates, done in a similar way, were fitted to the getaway car used in the shooting of the fruiterer Paul Vagona on the Eastern Freeway a couple of years later, which is interesting because it just shows the continuation of that method of setting up a shooting. Less public, but probably more risky than the Balti Bridge shooting, was the attempted assassination of a heavyweight bikie called Mark Belsilli, I think earlier that month. I think it was earlier in the July. The police didn't really know much about it at the time because he wasn't killed and he wasn't seriously injured. It was a cack-handed attempt to kill him. Now, Belsilli's an interesting cat because he's a bikie, but he's a bikie who lives in Brighton, which is a very upmarket suburb of Melbourne on the Bayside. He drives a Lamborghini, which, if you bought it new, might be worth $500,000. And he's a member at that stage of the Comanchero gang. But interestingly, he's on the outer with a very senior figure in the Comanchero club. Now, we won't bother mentioning that guy's name, but anybody who reads anything much about the Comancheros and bikies will realise that there is a significant heavy figure in that club, and he disapproved of certain colleagues and possibly used Hasan Topal, a bit of a rising star, to do some of his dirty work. Belsilli, although he wasn't seriously hurt in the shooting attempt, he apparently interpreted the shooting as a vote of no confidence in him as a member of the Comancheros. And so he soon joined the Mongols, a rival firm. He joined them fairly quickly, and he has since become their national sergeant at arms, which means he's the sort of heavy guy in chief head kicker. He is regularly pictured with a bullet-scarred Toby Mitchell, who's notorious and well known as a bikie heavyweight, and Toby Mitchell's little mate, former Richmond footballer Jake, the push-up king. Now, if, as police and other people suspect, Topal was involved in all 4 incidents, it was a hectic few months. But there's more. On August the 16th, which is a Wednesday night, a young boxer, Turkish kid, recently arrived over here from Perth, visits a friend in Currajong Road in what we would call the vibrant and multicultural and colourful outer suburb of Narre Warren, which I recently read was an Indigenous name for bad place or no good. Whether that is true, I couldn't be sure, but it might be, because a lot of bad stuff happens at Narre Warren. This young boxer is a relatively innocent geezer. He hasn't got much form. He's just a kid from Perth who's come across to Melbourne to further his career or whatever. His name is Zabi Isidya, something like that. I apologise to his family if that's a bad pronunciation. He has no real form, but he's shot dead outside this house in Currajong Road in Narre Warren. Now, police soon formed the view that the person who lived at that house, a guy called Muhammad Keshtiar, they think that guy was a far more likely candidate as a target for a shooting because he was a known Mongol associate and he was known to live at that address. And so this is just another fatal debacle. They just keep shooting the wrong people. Within 4 days of that shooting, the Comanchero start their national run, the one in 2017, that ended up in Canberra. And as we know, the brawl in Canberra, 4 nights later, is the 6th incident in 16 weeks. And it's the climax of an extraordinary string of murderous outrages. And as a detective said to a colleague of mine, he said to Mark Butler, my colleague and friend on the Herald Sun, and they're only the ones we know about. In other words, they're saying that Topal might have got up to other bad stuff as well that didn't get above the radar. Now, the police are not alone in rating Topal as the common denominator in all these shootings and strife. But what's behind it? What goes on? Surely a guy this well-educated and smart and switched on wouldn't be doing all this stuff just for fun. There must be a reason. Now, it's interesting that despite allegedly twice murdering the wrong people, which are pretty big stuff-ups, Topal still rose up the Comanchero hierarchy very swiftly. By April 2018, it was widely reported that he'd been installed as the commander of the gang of the Comanchero Southern Chapter. It was, according to one seasoned police operator, a reward for doing what he called heavy lifting. And some of that heavy lifting, police believe, was on behalf of the Comanchero National President, an enigmatic figure called Mick Murray. It seemed to observers that Topal, the former pretty boy, was prepared to get his hands dirty and do whatever it took to leapfrog up the ranks. He came out of nowhere, one source said. All of a sudden, he came up on the radar as a young, aggressive up-and-comer. I think he was trying to prove himself worthy of being Mick's lieutenant. Meanwhile, of course, some of the older heads in the crime business wondered if all this blind violence was good for business. For instance, Ahmad Malkoon, better known as J.L. Koon, who was the gang's former Victorian boss, living in Europe at the time, was reportedly at odds with Mick Murray. And this sort of enmity reflected probably deadly divisions within the club, which might give us a bit of an insight into why all these shootings happened. Now, for a young Turk, in both senses of the word, for a young Turk whose ambitions and ego possibly outstripped his ability, it was a chance for Hasan to climb the greasy pole of outlaw politics, which is a risky pastime, as he might discover if or when he returns to Australia from wherever it is that he's hiding out in Turkey, or maybe Greece or somewhere else over there. Anyway, one thing is for sure, the police are very keen to see him before the other bikies get to him. If he wants to come home, one of them told us, we're happy to pay the airfare. And that's the end of the story of Hasan Topal until the next chapter reveals itself.
Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is John Burton. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.